Welcome to the Washington Monthly Show. I'm Paul Glastris, editor-in-chief of the Washington Monthly. I'm here today with Washington Monthly good friend Melinda Henneberger. She's a lead political writer for Bloomberg Politics, and as I said, an old friend of the Washington Monthly. And we're coming to you from Washington D.C., deep in the heart of the beast here. It's hot, Melinda. Everybody's gone, but you and I are still plugging away.
We're the sole survivors, huh?
We are. I'm sporting my post-vacation beard, which I grow every vacation and then am lobbied to lop off, but I've postponed that so far, so
okay.
I could at least get one of these in. So it's supposed to be quiet in politics in August, and yet it's not. We've had.
I thought we disproved that a long time ago.
Right? I know it's an old chestnut that people do really leave Washington, but in August. But the politics and the policy doesn't stop. That's the amazing thing. So I wish
it's not in a pre-election year, right?
That's right. Yeah, sometimes it's a little easier. So I wish we had subjects other than Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump to occupy us. But
no, you don't.
No, I don't actually. And so I wanted to just start off, Melinda, by asking you about a story you have just written for Bloomberg Politics, and it has to do with the excuse Hillary Clinton has used from the beginning to, I don't want to say justify her email use, because she's more or less explained it was, a big mistake that she regrets doing, as well she should. But you've got an interesting piece up that argues that if she sticks to that excuse, which is, I did it out of convenience, I didn't want to have two cell phones rather than one, that's actually worse for her. If the truth is that was her excuse, that's worse. Explain.
Well, so I don't necessarily, a lot of her critics think, this can't possibly be true, that she would do this for convenience. I am not sure I buy that. I think, of course it's more convenient to have more privacy rather than less. So let's just think for a minute, what if her explanation, I think is a more neutral word than excuse.
There you go.
What if her explanation is right? If her explanation is right, and it may well be, then what she keeps arguing is, I was only thinking of my own convenience. Now, this is a woman who has logged a lot of time and hard work and years building up her credentials as someone who's really tough on the national security front in her time in the Senate, as Secretary of State, and especially with that really controversial 3 a.m. phone call campaign ad during her previous presidential run, when she's saying, when disaster strikes in the middle of the night, you really want me in the Oval and on the case rather than Barack Obama. So now I just wonder if she isn't, in continuing to present herself as someone who puts her own convenience first, or who, as her communications director, Jennifer Palmieri, said, she just wasn't thinking this through. Is that really an argument for someone who's going to be commander-in-chief?
Right.
So I don't at all think that she's necessarily hiding anything in particular. I think it could well be that her default response is to get the maximum amount of privacy, even though, she certainly is skirting correct FOIA procedures. I'm not sure that it makes her look as good as she thinks it does to be arguing that she was going for convenience and didn't think it through.
When she says convenience, doesn't she mean, I didn't want two phones flopping around in my purse or briefcase? When that 3 a.m. phone call comes, I want to grab the one phone and not the wrong phone, the other phone. Does she up and up say the privacy was the matter of convenience, or was it just...
No, she doesn't. She says, I think you're right. When she says convenience, she has said, I thought it would be more convenient to use one phone rather than two. Turns out I was wrong. That's a long way to go to get if it's such an onerous burden to have two phones in your purse, then you also wonder, gosh, what would a lot of the really tough challenges you have as president, how would those strike her? So I'm not so sure about that, but yes, that is what she's talking about, having one device instead of two.
And just while we're on this kind of picayune subject, back in 2008, it wasn't that easy to get. It wasn't that easy to have both your work email and your personal email on the same phone, was it? We've all experienced the evolution of cell phone technology.
A blur, Paul. I know.
And I'm just wondering if there's like any truth to the proposition that it was kind of a pain to have both. But I can't remember my own cell phone evolution on that one.
I can't either. But having a private server is certainly unusual.
Right, except that preceded her being Secretary of State, right? I think the hole she fell in, and I'm just guessing here, but human nature, she had this super secure, I presume, server set up for her husband, on which she had a private email thing, and the government came in and said, here's a new email we want you to use. And she said, no, I don't want to do that. Other secretaries of state have used their private email. I'm going to use that. And she probably didn't think it through. The sort of classic pose of the media, and I say pose, though sometimes it's true, is what she really wanted to do was hide her private email. That the whole scandal is sort of built on that. But I think what she tried to do is connect with the average American, saying, who wants to carry two cell phones? That was my mistake. You can understand that. I'm not sure it's worked. But
average Joes and Janes, though, do carry two cell phones and don't find it that big a deal.
Right.
When you say human nature, I think it's really human nature to create the thing you fear. And the thing that she obviously does fear is handing any ammo to her enemies, and she has.
Yes. And if this was ultimately an effort to keep stuff away from her enemies, boy, it sure hasn't worked, because now we have a much bigger footprint of her private dealings than any candidate I can think of.
Right.
So one of the curious things I wanted to ask you about is the lack of coverage outside of the email thing of Hillary Clinton's foreign policy achievements, her years as Secretary of State, and prior to that being on the Senate Armed Services Committee. Most of what she's talked about, she's chosen to talk about, has been domestic policy.
Right.
And yet, her most recent career has been all about foreign policy. Why do you think that is?
I think she's probably, I think because that's what this election is going to be about to a great extent. And certainly in the Democratic space, there's a very strong feeling. I mean, she's responding to Bernie Sanders and the unseen Elizabeth Warren and Martin O'Malley to a lesser extent. I think the decision has been made that this election is about inequality. This election is about, how we treat the have-nots, how the inequality has persisted over all this time, about things like wage stagnation. So I think she's right to make that decision. But I think the lack of attention to her foreign policy experience is going to come. I think that one thing Donald Trump is not wrong about is when he calls this the summer of Trump. So I think Trump is sucking so much of the oxygen out of this season, and everything is really seen through the prism of what he's doing. And he's drawing all the crowds, along with Bernie Sanders. So I just don't think it seems like the moment for that, but there certainly will be. And whoever the Republican nominee turns out to be is going to be making the argument that they're all already making, that they all call her the worst, the most disastrous Secretary of State in American history. I'm not sure they could, every one of them could name any other nominees for that post, for that position.
Right.
But we're definitely going to get there. But of course, you're right that we should be looking at that.
No, I think your explanation is dead on. That's exactly why there hasn't been this discussion. Neither she nor the base voters nor the reporters really want to have that discussion right now for understandable reasons. But let me give you an example of the oddity of it not being part of the debate, and that is, over the next few weeks, Barack Obama either will or won't be able to get his Iran deal through Congress. She was a pretty major part of the diplomacy around that Iran deal. It would seem like a perfect opportunity for someone in the press or on the Republican side or the Democratic side to either criticize the deal or praise the deal, either criticize her role in pulling together the sanctions, the diplomacy that created the sanctions, or praise her for that. When they,
how much has she been trying to take that credit for the deal? A deal that's, really dividing people, even on the Democratic side.
I don't know. I know she mentioned when the deal was announced in July, I think, that yes, she had taken, played a major role in the, paving the way for it. But I haven't listened to every one of her speeches. Maybe she brings it up, but I don't think she's brought it up much. So
I don't think she's emphasized it.
Yeah.
I think as you say, she's mentioned it. But right, she's concentrating on a whole list of domestic policy projects.
So just to keep in our theme of sort of Hillary Clinton and foreign policy, I want to sort of vent a little bit about Benghazi, if I might. The new issue of the Washington. Yeah, well, one has to take one's opportunities. So in the new issue of the Washington Monthly, I wrote the Tilting at Windmills column, and in there I sort of make the argument that, I pose the question, why are Republican voters so in the grips of Benghazi fever?
And they are.
And they are.
Oh, on the campaign trail, they really are focused still on Benghazi. That's a fact.
And the argument that I hear from pundits and analysts is, well, the Republicans know it's a good weapon against Hillary Clinton, and surely it is. But I don't, and I don't think base Republican voters are thinking quite of it that way. I think Benghazi stirs something in the national, or at least conservative national soul. And my argument in the piece is that to understand it, you have to go back to 1979 and the Iran hostage crisis, because back then, those of us who are old enough to you're clearly not old enough to remember this, but those of us who are old enough to remember this remember the sort of nail-biting 444-day trauma that hostage crisis was, and it did three things.
Thank you, Paul, but I do remember that.
Oh, not possible. The first was that it happened, as you recall, in the middle of the campaign between Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan, and ended literally as Ronald Reagan was taking the oath of office.
Republicans bring up all the time.
Yes.
There are a number of the current candidates who bring up the fact that happened the next day. And they argue that, see, all it took was having the right guy and those hostages were out. That's what I'm going to do for you. That's what a number of them argue. It's
interesting to hear you say that people still bring that up, because what I think is that sort of validated the inner Republican sense that they and only they can provide security to the country, that Democrats are simply too feckless. Another thing that it did, I think, was to politicize the killing of diplomats. And by that I mean, in the 11 years prior to that hostage crisis, America lost 5 U.S. ambassadors were murdered in places like Sudan and Guatemala.
Mm-hmm.
None of those killings became a political scandal in which one party charged the other party with the sense of that there was some kind of incompetence that went to the top. There were no big investigations that presumed political motive for not protecting our ambassador. All that crazy stuff that come out of Benghazi, and so the end result of that is that I think the security situation for our ambassadors has become like a prison. Anyone who's worked overseas in the press and dealt with diplomats knows that these poor guys, especially in unstable countries, which is where a lot of journalists spend their time, these poor diplomats can't leave the compound. They can't go out and do interviews in places that matter with average people or tea shop owners or whatever without heavy security or even at all, where the journalists are able to move freely. That has really hurt our capacity, our diplomatic capacity to get things done, to have good eyes and ears on the ground.
Well, it's obviously a trade-off. I mean, Chris Stevens, as you argue in your piece, was such a hero in refusing to do that. And, of course, what happened is a tragedy. Right.
But Chris Stevens is, of course, one of the 4 diplomats killed in Benghazi. And I didn't know him personally, but he was widely recognized within the diplomatic corps as somebody who managed to take risks, and the risks paid off. He was the go-between between the rebels fighting Muammar Gaddafi and the U.S. government, and we worked openly on the streets of Benghazi. When he went back, nobody understood the poor situation on the ground there more than he did. He died, but his death becomes this giant political divide in the country where it didn't before. And I think the end result is that what the Republicans are doing on Benghazi, continuing, we're now on our 8th bipartisan investigation of this thing. Nothing has come out scandalous yet. In fact, virtually every argument for scandal has been undermined by previous bipartisan investigations. What they're doing, whether they understand it or not, is making it difficult for our diplomats to do what Chris Stevens did, which is take some risks in order to advance American diplomacy. And I don't think we could, the security we've wrapped our diplomats in has saved lives, but it's also come at the cost of the effectiveness of our diplomacy. And, we lose military people in Afghanistan, alas, frequently, but they're doing their jobs to fulfill the mission. And I know from talking to diplomats, they want to do their jobs, even at some personal risk, to fulfill the mission. And what Benghazi ultimately becomes is a kind of scandalization of bravery in that way.
I really think that's a good argument, and I enjoyed your piece about it. I think that the only real scandal is why the requests for more security there seem to have gone unanswered. To continue to focus on who said what on TV in the initial days doesn't strike me as very interesting or productive. And the thing that you hear from Republican voters most often on this topic is what is her appearance before one of the committees when she said, at this point, what possible difference does it make? Now, of course, they are taking her words out of context. She wasn't saying what possible difference does it make that these diplomats died. She wasn't washing her hands of the whole thing. But that soundbite really has stuck with people and, as you say, does hit them on a very visceral level. What are we doing to protect these people who represent us throughout the rest of the world? Ironically, I think it is Republicans who wanted, although I don't think they succeeded, succeeded at it, to cut the security budgets of embassies around the world.
That's right.
But I think that is a proper focus for lessons learned from Benghazi.
Yeah, well, it goes to the point that we've politicized our diplomats, and any attack on our diplomats is an attack on America itself. And again, that goes back to 1979 when Ted Koppel used to do those nightly broadcasts.
Oh gosh, right.
Remember that? The sense of American effrontery was built into the title of the programs. It was America Held Hostage, right? And I just think when, and I come from Republican stock, so I can say this. I think when Republicans, the end result of 1979 was that it made diplomats seem like something that was a stand-in for the country as a whole, and hence the murder of a diplomat is an affront to the dignity and security of the United States, which we don't think of when it comes to our soldiers. Obviously, we want to protect them, but the average Republican thinks, well, sometimes brave men and women die in battle defending us. But the same does not hold true for diplomats since 1979.
Well, I'd like to see more consistency in these stirrings of protective feelings toward our diplomats. I mean, let's really take care of them then.
Yeah, how about it? So we've talked about Hillary, and I think we must turn to Donald Trump.
If we must.
A lot of news. There was a story recently in the New York Times that dug into the polling data on who Trump's supporters are. I think there was a lot of speculation in the early weeks of his ascendancy because there was so little polling data on who was supporting him. Is it unemployed white males? Is it the white working class? Is it the sort of the anti-immigrant contingent within the Republican base? All pretty good presumptions, I thought, but a lot more data is out there now, and the New York Times was able to parse it in more specific ways to look at Republicans who are Republican-leaning but don't vote versus those who are likely to vote in primary campaigns. So I wanted to ask you, as someone who I know from your writing has been out there interviewing Trump voters, you were out in New Hampshire a couple weeks ago, right?
Right.
What is your sense of the Trump voter? Who are these folks?
All kinds of people, as the polling numbers show. And you even see many people who seem to be contradicting their core issues. There is the pro-life voter who says, John McCain wasn't pure enough for me. Mitt Romney wasn't pure enough for me. But Donald Trump, who until a minute ago was pro-choice and who still speaks in some ways quite highly of Planned Parenthood, well, nobody's perfect. Again and again, you see that this feeling of authenticity is more important to them than any specific interest, even in cases when it's their core issue.
Right.
I hear that again and again from, can you hear me?
Oh, absolutely.
I wasn't too surprised by the polling. So it's an astonishing thing that he has tapped into, but it does really come back to, I think, this feeling that he, the phrase you hear again and again, he tells it like it is. He says what's on his mind. That's not quite the same as some people say he tells the truth. There are, in fact, a number of inaccuracies in what he says, but he definitely speaks his mind, so that you even hear people who loved Megyn Kelly until she took on Donald Trump, and now feel, how dare she do that? That really was unseemly of her. You hear women saying, no, I wasn't at all put off because I love how refreshing it is that he speaks so much from, either his heart or, the top of his mind.
The one of the sort of debating points of this campaign is the resurrection of the term politically correct. I went to grad school at a time where I had Marxist-leaning professors who used the term without irony. That's dating myself, but the term has come to the fore in these debates and in the campaign, both from Ben Carson, who is uses the term sort of every third sentence, and I think as Ed Kilgore, our blogger, and my normal co-host has said, to mean anything that deviates from conservative policy is politically incorrect. But there is something about the way Donald Trump speaks, and it seems to me both from the gut and also deeply practiced, that he manages to tap into a sense of frustration with voters that they have to police their thoughts and language based on evolving politics that they don't necessarily agree with, don't necessarily understand. And, one example is this term that has come up in recent days of anchor babies. Now, my friend Kevin Drum over at Mother Jones, who's a good progressive and all that, wrote a post saying, "I understand that the term anchor babies, signifies an idea. The idea being that women who are not citizens or not documented." Let me turn that off right away. That they come to the United States, have their babies here, the babies become citizens, and that somehow provides an anchor, a way for them to bring that child and maybe their whole family in under the wire. That could be an offensive idea, but that the term anchor baby doesn't on the surface seem like something that would be offensive. And he was honestly saying, what is it about these two words that are offensive? And I still haven't quite heard an argument that they are offensive other than people who are of recent immigrant stock see it as an attack, feel it is offensive, and therefore would ask us all not to use it. Which I think
the whole idea is what's offensive,
right?
As much as the actual words,
right?
It's what they signify that is offensive, because what they signify is that there are all these people who are trying to scam us, and that's offensive.
No question, and I think that was Kevin's point. But if you're going to discuss the subject of anchor babies, remember Jeb Bush was asked this a few days ago. A journalist said, that's an offensive term. And he said, what other term do you have? And the journalist really didn't have an answer to that. And Donald Trump has said, I'm going to use the term anchor baby.
I think when Donald Trump talks about political correctness, and he's not really talking about, in very many of the cases, political correctness. Maybe that one is an example, but he's mostly talking about common courtesy. He's mostly talking about good manners.
Right.
He's talking about, like he makes fun of Rand Paul for being short. That's normally thought to be not very nice manners, but people love it when he does stuff like that.
Yeah.
Or saying something like Heidi Klum is sadly no longer a 10. I mean, that's just why. Normally we would say, what boorish, terrible behavior, but people seem to love the refreshing, off-the-cuff authenticity of his rudeness.
Well, I guess what I'm getting at is I think that there's a big chunk of the country that for many years has found that there are ideas in their heads or jokes they want to make or words they want to use that are off limits because of evolving political norms that they do not control and don't necessarily agree with, even if they're maybe partly sympathetic to it.
And I think that there's something to that. Wherever you are on the political spectrum, I think we can have a real argument about, certain ideas and orthodoxies being off limits for discussion. That is interesting to me. But just to translate that into, let's say, any rude thing that pops into our heads is another matter.
Yeah, and to translate that into a shield against crackpot ideas, right? I'm not an expert on the anchor baby phenomenon, but my sense is there are vanishingly few cases like this. The sort of the same as individual voter fraud. It happens once in a blue moon, and one doesn't build policy around, damaging policy around, very, very rare instances. Well,
I don't think you can be the party that values babies to such a degree, and also the party that refers to them in this way, and will build a wall as high as it takes to keep them out.
Right. Well, speaking of politically correct, I'm going to pose a politically incorrect proposition to you, and that is, if you presume a Republican is going to win in 2016, wouldn't a Democrat rather it be Donald Trump than any of the others?
I have been saying the exact same thing.
Well,
because
great minds think alike.
I think it is this idea that it offends some sensibilities, like that he's this vulgarian, that he's getting away with murder in not setting out specific policies that people can accept or reject. The system isn't supposed to work this way. But if you think of it as what he is likely to do as president,
exactly.
I think there's absolutely no question that he is the least conservative of the 17 right now Republican contenders.
Yeah, he just
by a long shot.
He just came out.
Berlusconi,
right.
in Italy. Whose main public policy drive was to pass laws that were excellent for Berlusconi.
Well, he just came out in favor of increasing taxes on carried interest, which is the loophole that sustains the hedge fund and private equity industries. And that position of his is a core Democratic position now and has been for a number of years. Barack Obama has been pushing it. Hillary Clinton, Elizabeth, everybody's on the left wants to get rid of the carried interest loophole. Here, Donald Trump comes out in favor of it. He's obviously less of a hardcore anti-choice person than anyone else in the field. The wall. Well, if I'm a Democrat, I think, look, I don't want us to build a wall. But we already have, a partial wall. And if he can get we already have more or less net immigration, illegal or legal, from Mexico anyway. So, is he really any worse on that subject than any of the other, candidates? I don't think so.
It's worse, and yet I think progressive could also take some comfort from the fact that it's not going to happen.
Right.
11 million people, or 12, cannot be rounded up, sent back, and then culled to see who's a good person and by what basis.
Yeah, moreover, it's going to require Democrats
at any price. And would be prohibitively expensive.
Yeah, Democrats are never going to support the budget for that anyway. Yeah.
So if you take that impossible dream of keeping all dreamers down off the table, I'm not sure. And also these headlines that say he's boots on the ground for ISIS. If you look back at the transcript of what Donald Trump actually said on Meet the Press a week ago, what Chuck Todd asked him was, so, boots on the ground in Iraq? And he said, yeah, sure, we can do that. You don't get the sense from him. When he's on the stump, what he really wants to talk about is rebuilding infrastructure,
right,
which is not exactly an assault on what progressives would like to see happen.
No, it's quite the center of what progressives would like to see happen.
And he talks about bringing jobs in, bringing manufacturing back, creating jobs. These are the two things he talks about, infrastructure and jobs. He also cares a lot about trade, obviously. And, I think a big secret to his appeal, kind of a dual secret to his appeal, is on the one hand, yes, he gives voice to these frustrations. But on the other hand, he makes it sound so appealingly easy.
Right.
And in that way, when he compares himself to Ronald Reagan, there is a comparison. Even though the one was so sunny and Donald Trump is so cloudy, and even he calls himself whiny, his argument is, I've got this. We don't need shared sacrifice. We don't need a long, hard road back to solvency. No. All we need to do is get a smart guy like me in with a bunch of my smart friends, and we just make a couple of phone calls, and we've got it.
Yeah, he sounds like a real estate developer talking to a city council, saying, I've done 100 of these projects. I'm going to get this done. It'll take a week and a half, and you guys don't have to worry. He's a master salesman. But imagine he's President Trump, and he's facing a Congress that has a non-insubstantial Democratic presence. Probably they get the Senate back. I can imagine Donald Trump being much more likely to break with the conservative Republican base and cut deals with the Democrats than I can Marco Rubio or, Scott Walker or any of them.
He says on the stump and gets applause that he knows it's not conservative, but he wants to see people taken care of, is his phrase.
Yeah.
Taken care of.
So
there's a very paternalistic strain in the way he speaks.
Good point.
When he talks about women too, women haven't been well taken care of. I'm going to do more for women to take care of you.
For the women.
Specifics. Yes, for the women. Right.
So just to kind of wrap up our conversation here, Melinda, Democrats have sort of been fascinated / horrified by Donald Trump, but essentially enjoying the whole spectacle because it has thrown the Republican field into such disarray and created heartburn for the Jeb Bushes and Scott Walkers of the world. And so, in a sense, this has been a fun summer for Democrats, and they've been rooting for him. But what we're saying here, which I don't think anyone is out there saying yet, is Democrats have a second reason to root for the guy, because if we have to have a Republican president, it might as well be him.
I think that a lot of people still don't think it could happen, so I think that's an obstacle. I think there are a lot of people who still think this is a joke, and I do not think it's a joke.
So let's leave it with predictions. The CW a month and a half ago was Donald Trump, is a flash in the pan. The CW now is he's not. On the spectrum of those two CWs, I'm more with the later one right now. I do see, and Steve Waldman in our last broadcast laid out a scenario where if you have a lot of candidates who stay a long time because they have billionaire backers, that even with 25% of the vote, Trump can conceivably win the nomination. So prediction from you is do you see him winning the nomination?
Oh, I think that's absolutely unknowable at this point, and I wouldn't go so far as to say either yes or no.
Okay, well let me rephrase the question then. On the spectrum of 0 is the old CW, 10 is the new CW. He can go all the way. Where are you?
I can absolutely go all the way. I'm not saying he will. That's unknowable. But can he? Absolutely yes.
Yes.
So I give a high probability that he could become the nominee.
Yeah, I agree with you.
What an interesting race that would be to cover.
Well, that leaves more to talk about in our next installation of the Washington Monthly Show. I want to thank my friend and guest, Melinda Henneberger, from Bloomberg Politics. Melinda, it's been a delight to have you on the show. I hope you'll come back again.
I will. Thanks for having me.
Okay, enjoy the day. Bye-bye.
You too. Take care. Thanks.